Hi, Hunter Hastings here. There's a considerable debate going on in business circles these days about the role of management. Today, we understand more and more about complex, evolving systems where the outcomes are emergent and they can't be directed or planned or managed at all. Is there an alternative? Yes, entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship seeks to embrace uncertainty, understand nonlinearity, and find ways to unleash that emergence through experimentation.
This is the Value Creators Podcast. Value creation is the sole purpose of any business and every business, and for all of us as entrepreneurs. Listen to great value creators as they share their successes, trials, and lessons learned. Join us as we explore how to think as value creators, how to act as value creators, and how to view business through the lens of value creation.
This adaptive entrepreneurial method has actually been codified by Mark McGrath, who's our guest today. Mark is a highly credentialed expert in modern business methods, and especially in the approach that we call agile. He was a U.S. Marine, where a lot of the new thinking about organization and operations emerged as a result of the VUCA environments in which the Marines are always working. He's also worked in the development of organizational learning and trading systems in some of the world's largest financial services companies. He's today the Chief Learning Officer at AGLX, a leading global consultancy for the advanced adaptive strategies and innovations that are required today. Mark, welcome again to the Value Creators Podcast.
Thanks again for having me, Hunter. It's always good to be back.
Well, it's our privilege, and we're going to talk today about the subject of management. You are a student, you're an expert in uncertainty and the implications of uncertainty. You study it for your clients and you advise them how to, let's say, manage under conditions of uncertainty. But management is undergoing a lot of rethinking at the moment, and we wonder whether management is even something you can do in this uncertain world. It implies some kind of imposition of order. It implies some control. It implies some predictability. And I'm not sure whether that's even possible these days, whether we should eliminate the term management. And in complex adaptive systems, we understand that new patterns emerge, which is not the same as management. You can't manage emergence. So let me start there. What's your thinking about management under uncertainty and how we should think about it?
Yeah, I don't think much on management. We talk about leadership, specifically distributed leadership, which is less of a command and control model. And it is what John Boyd would have called appreciation in leadership. Appreciation in that I can recognize the value or worth of something. I can comprehend it. I can understand it. And leadership being the ability to, not really the ability, the art rather, of influencing and inspiring others on a team, for example, or within an organization to cooperate together to achieve uncommon goals with enthusiasm. So we don't really talk about management too much in that respect. Management, to me, it strikes me as more attempting to be too scientific, too linear, too formulaic, that there's some sort of process or spreadsheet I could run and it's going to give me the answers of what I'm up against in business or sport or anything else. When, as you mentioned, complex adaptive systems, complexity is not, it's not like that. Things emerge and novelty emerges, and things are always in a state of ceaseless flux. It's very hard to manage that. Remember too, with leadership is for people, and we operate on the idea of people, ideas, then things, always in that order, and viable, always in that order. Whereas management's more for resources, numbers, and that sort of thing.
So, Mark, as economists, we would use the term entrepreneurship and the methods of entrepreneurship to describe what you were just talking about in terms of the art of navigating uncertainty and the mindset for doing that, and perhaps the leadership. Does that fit from a business standpoint, that we should think about entrepreneurship as the method for value creation within the context of what you just described?
I think so. You and I have discussed about leadership before. I'm always referring to leadership as the quality, not necessarily the title or a post that would assume something was hierarchical or in a command and control environment. I think that entrepreneurship is what John Boyd was talking about, continuously reorienting, that we have to continuously change our perspective, change our frame of reference, and that everything is always in a state of ceaseless flux, as we said. And that's the nature of complexity. It's nonlinear, it's asymmetric, it can't be quantified, it's characterized by uncertainty, it's characterized by quick, sudden change that was not able to be predicted. And that's the realm of business. That's the realm of people. And I think that entrepreneurship is most appropriate there because there we can change our frame of reference fast and move. I think it was one of the Rothbard books that talks about how entrepreneurship translated was something like of an undertaking. And as we undertake and we pursue certain goals or objectives that we have, we understand that the methodologies and the systems that we're going to have to use, they all have to be adaptable and flexible, given the nature of complexity, everything always changing. When I think of management, and I don't talk about management much, but I think of people looking at the world as if it were linear, as if it were symmetrical, as if everything could be done with a template or a formula or something I learned in business school, and it can solve every problem, and it can't, or as if it could predict the future, and it can't, because again, things are always changing, and those models, those frame of references, those linear approaches are almost instantly obsolete.
Yeah, so the economists tend to talk about entrepreneurship as kind of the early stage of value creation. All the uncertainty you talked about, they run experiments, they bring new combinations of resources to bear, they invent new products and services. But then the economists tend to turn to management as the continuation part after that. Once you've established a new value, you've created a new market, you've got some customers, then management is the preservation of the profitable state of what you just created, and maybe some cost control to reduce costs and that kind of thing. But again, I'd like to help people think about entrepreneurship as continuous and never ending. And that
Yeah, that's how we would see it. And as much that an entrepreneur is alive and breathing, because you can manage those things, you can control the things that you're talking about, costs, and I can manage fuel, I can manage things within my supply chain, I can manage inventory. But if I don't have innovative, creative thinkers that are constantly revising and update the model as we go to market, keep creating novelty, stay relevant, none of that top management stuff will matter anyway. I mean, I think we've used this a couple of times in our discussions, but I'm sure Blockbuster had phenomenal managers that were really good at managing inventory and that were really good at managing what the stores needed and hiring people and firing people and that kind of thing. But it didn't much matter when the overall idea, the entrepreneurial idea, if you will, it was a entropic system, right? It didn't put any new energy behind it, and it got destroyed basically by Netflix because people were thinking and adapting to the change and influencing how people interacted with the home video market versus using a retail experience, but shifting over to something streaming, delivered differently, that kind of thing. So like if your idea, the value that you're creating, I guess, if it's a disconnect from reality, how well you manage it won't matter.
Right. Well, there's also the implication there in the Blockbuster Netflix example, and the same in Kodak and digital photography, that Blockbuster knew about Netflix. In fact, Netflix apparently came to Blockbuster and offered to sell the company to them. They turned them down because they were trying to preserve what they had as opposed to think about, experiment with a new future. And the same for Kodak. They didn't want to destroy the film business. They were managing that. So they knew about digital photography. In fact, they pioneered some of the technology, but they never applied it. So perhaps management is trying to preserve and entrepreneurship is exploring new futures.
That's a fair statement. I would agree with that. There's no, at the highest level, their strategy or it didn't match with what people wanted. And they had a system where no one would want to do something different or something new because they want to stuck with what they've always done all along. And to your point, maybe they wanted to continue to manage that because that's where all my stock options are. That's where my career has been invested in film. And this novelty, it creates a mismatch. And what we do with mismatches is going to have a profound effect on whether we survive or not, or forget thriving. You're not going to be able to thrive if you don't survive. But those mismatches are generated internally or externally. And that's part of sort of the entrepreneurial process that requires leadership, and it requires feedback in a psychologically safe environment where we can learn faster than our competitors when those mismatches arise, when we can identify them and deal with them, or we can create mismatches for our competitors. For example, as you mentioned, Kodak's not there anymore, Blockbuster's not there anymore. Well, there was a massive mismatch, but at the same time, there's also a lot of mismatches that are being created. The one side can't deal with. They can't understand. They can't interpret. What they've always done is not working, and they double down on that. And they don't have the flexibility or the agility to try new things. They don't have the freedom to explore and to innovate, and they become obsolete. They become irrelevant.
Yeah, so you used a interesting term there, Mark, mismatches, and I know that it comes from some of your work on John Boyd and the system that he's associated with. Maybe entrepreneurship is in the business of creating mismatches in our own favor, the competitive advantage, and maybe management is trying to avoid mismatches or ignore them or refuse to be stimulated by them. Is that a way to think about it?
Could be, yeah. Maybe they don't solve them. They don't recognize the threat. It's football season, and you and I are both football fans, and I always like to think of, I've used this example a lot, of the weak side is called the weak side on the left because most quarterbacks are right-handed. And sometime, I guess, late 70s, early 80s, there's a player, Lawrence Taylor, that is just plowing through the weak side and the left tackles to the point where he's almost, he's ending quarterbacks' careers. He hits them so hard, and teams had to make an adjustment to that. They had to there's the mismatch, right? Lawrence Taylor identified the mismatch, and he ran right up it, and he was faster and more nimble and more agile. And the role of a left tackle and a left guard became a lot more important when you're facing a novel threat like a Lawrence Taylor, who, by the way, others that follow in his footsteps are also going to emulate because he's shown a new way to play a certain position. Others are going to emulate it because it worked. Well, there was a big mismatch, and if you didn't account for that mismatch, you might have wound up with a quarterback with a broken leg and a career ended. So, of course, I'm referring to Joe Theismann in those days, but yeah, that's the thing. Like if we don't, in fact, I published an article recently about this for football season and for football coaches. If we don't identify mismatches, if we're not creating mismatches for our opponents, if we don't know how to adapt and deal with mismatches, we're never going to thrive. We're not going to be able to thrive in complex nonlinear environments. Football is that. We might think, no, I know what it is. It's linear. There's two sides. There's 11 players with infinite possibilities. There's no way, and things are always changing, and rules are changing. And how do we deal with that? That's where these mismatches come from. And the idea of mismatches is big because if you can't deal with them, as Boy would say, now you've got a situation. And in this situation, if I'm going to just double down on what always worked, that's not going to get me any further. And I have another article about why a lot of these coaches are getting fired. They don't change. They stay wed to the plan. They stay, I'm from so-and-so's coaching tree, and this is how we've always done it. And they can't deal with the change. In other words, they can't reorient. They can't handle the mismatches as they come in and deal with that. They can't do it because they're just incapable of being open to the possibilities that things are changing. And thus they don't make any changes. And that's how they become unemployed in the football coaching world.
Yeah, and I think the term mismatches and the concept of mismatches is a great addition to the thinking about entrepreneurship. We talk about competitive advantage, think of it in those structural terms, but actually the idea of creating mismatches deliberately, that's disruptive innovation. That's the kind of thing that Clayton Christensen talked about.
Yeah, we've talked before about disruption in design. If you're working with my competitors, I have to disrupt that relationship and I have to meet it with the design of what it is that I do. Otherwise, you're not going to become my customer. You're not going to become my client. If you're stuck to what you've been doing and it's indisruptible, well, then no amount of design is going to get you over to being my customer. But there's always a sort of a balance between those two things, like a yin and yang. I have to disrupt and design, or as Boyd would say, or Schumpeter would say, I have to create and destroy. This is a constant back and forth of destruction and creation.
You developed the adaptive entrepreneurial system. I was privileged to put my name down as co-author on a couple of papers that we published, but it's your system. And it helps us think about entrepreneurship as a continuous ongoing activity as opposed to just startups and formation. There's a couple of keys to it, but we'll put a visual up, Mark, on the video version of the podcast, and we'll put the graphic in our show notes. But try to walk people through the adaptive entrepreneurial method as a kind of continuous ongoing loop of value creation. I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, it was essentially what I had approached you with originally many years ago, that I always saw this connection between Austrian economics, specifically praxeology, emergent order, the things that Hayek would talk about, and the theory of dynamic efficiency that Jesus Huerta de Soto would talk about. I always saw it lining up and connecting with John Boyd, who we've talked a lot about, but for those that don't know, basically he was a strategist, has had a lot of influence on a wide variety of organizations. Originally it started with the military. First organization that really bought into his ideas wholesale was the Marine Corps, where I came from, where I spent 6 years as an officer. And I would learn these ideas because in any environment that we were sent into to fight in a war would be a chaotic, nonlinear, complex environment with no predictability, no symmetry. So we had to be equipped to lead Marines in that environment. So to influence and inspire other humans in unpredictable, nonlinear environments. And when I left the Marine Corps and I got into the business world, and I started studying Austrian economics, I started to see the fusion of the two worlds and thinking that it seems to me that Mises and Hayek and John Boyd are actually all saying the same thing, that everything's in a state of flux, order emerges, and we can't verify a system within itself. Any sort of internal trying to verify our systems from within inside are only going to make us entropic, subject to entropy at a faster pace. And I always saw this combination. And then as I got more into it, and I originally kicked you this proposal, I said, if you look at entrepreneurialism, it's a lot like war fighting, working in nonlinear, complex environments where I have to have an agile way of thinking that allows me to update my understanding of reality faster than the market, faster than my competitors, faster than the rate of change, and be able to inspire and influence others, whether it's customers, clients, to inspire and influence them to become my customers and clients, or it's teammates where I have to, or subordinates where I'd have to inspire and influence them to achieve a common goal with enthusiasm. And I thought, well, isn't this interesting? We can put the two worlds together and see that if I'm an entrepreneur, I want to stay relevant. I want to be able to stay ahead or tap into something that's going on in a market where I've identified a mismatch that I can exploit a mismatch to get profit, to get people to make a decision to do something or to buy something or to use a service or a good that would give me recognize a profit. That's kind of how it started. And what I knew of those two worlds again is that I had to have an acceptance that things are always changing and they're always in flux, and that novelty and things are always emerging. Secondly, I had to understand, and this is where OODA comes in, and people have heard of OODA loop. We always use it, OODA loop in quotes, and then sketch, just as John Boyd did. It's not a recipe, it's not a formula, and it's not really a loop. But you and I have talked a lot about orientation, that our cognition, our cognitive software, our internal operating system has to be interactive with reality and have a continuously updated understanding of reality in order to make observations effectively, in order to make decisions and subsequent actions effectively, and be able to learn from them fast enough so I continue to reorient. In other words, I break and adapt my models, my understanding of the world to stay ahead so that I remain relevant to my clients and customers. That was sort of the big mission. And, as we still continue to talk about it and refine and revise it, the real core stays the same, is that markets are volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. We orient to that, and orientation is our understanding and how we formulate our observations to make our judgment and decisions and those subsequent actions, and then how we learn from that in order to adapt. If we don't learn, we can't adapt, and if we don't adapt, we can't survive, and we certainly can't thrive.
One of the elements that you put into the adaptive entrepreneurial method, Mark, which I think is really important but sometimes difficult to think about, is the idea of intent, entrepreneurial intent, which isn't planning and it isn't strategy. It's kind of goal-oriented, but it's adjustable as you change your orientation. Talk to us about intent and how you think about that in the system.
There's a few ways. One way, again, channeling Boyd, would be what are we all focused and directed towards? What is it that we're all trying to achieve? If it's, say, the Walt Disney Company, we're all geared towards making people's dreams come true. That's our intent. So whatever we do as janitors, as people working in the hotel, and people operating the rides, and people, musicians, waiters, waitresses, whoever's working at Disney, everything that we do, no matter what we're actually doing, is all focused and directed towards that overall intent to make people's dreams come true with a world-class entertainment experience. That's the mission. That's what we're focused on. It's more subjective, I guess you'd say. It's a subscription. We subscribe to this. We're going to work together, and we're going to empower people. That's another component of this. We're going to empower people to make decisions fast with a variety of options, to work together in harmony as they take initiative to achieve that intent for us as a company or as a firm, and for those that we attract to that. That's where the clients and the customers come in. If we're doing our job right, we attract the right people, and we recognize and realize the profit. If we don't, and we're disconnected, or we violate the compact that we have with customers and clients, or we fail to innovate, we fail to understand the marketplace, or we fail to understand what people actually want, and we haven't changed anything, then entropy takes over, and we become Blockbuster, we become Kodak, and everything else.
Yeah, I always think of intent as filtering that reorientation as you describe, and then transmitting that to the decision and action part of OODA. So it guides action, and we think of entrepreneurship as action, not thinking. The other important part is the feedback loop. So we read about that in complex adaptive systems literature and so on. There can be positive and negative feedback, and that's got to drive the reorientation, right? How do we make sure that we're using feedback properly in the corporation, in a business?
Well, as we've said, there's no organization or team that can thrive or survive, rather, let alone thrive, if they're not a learning organization, if they're not adapting. And you can't adapt if you're not learning. And that loop, so I like to say when I describe OODA, OODA is nothing more than how my orientation functions, and the loop is nothing more than the feedback that I get via learning, that if I'm doing it well, my orientation, or that cognitive understanding and software, is constantly updating and revising itself. That's the learning that I'm doing to make the adjustments that I need to make in my decisions and my actions as we advance through time, or as we advance in our marketplace. And it scales. So I have to do it as the entrepreneur. Us as a team, we have a collective orientation. Us as a larger organization, orientation is fractal. So I have one, you have one. We work together on an academic paper. Our orientations intersect such that we could do that twice. We coordinated action together to write 2 papers. The value creators, there's an orientation that we all align to somewhat. Our uniqueness and our own orientations, we see some connection that we come here and we listen and we learn. It's the same thing inside of an organization. So as we work together and we cooperate and we collaborate in the right type of environment, we're always getting feedback from every level of the business that's helping us learn to make the necessary adjustments that we have to do to decisions and actions so that we can improve our capacity for free and independent action, which was what Boyd talked about in his original work, Destruction and Creation. That's why we decide, that's why we act, that's why we reorient individually or as teams in order to improve our capacity for free and independent action. In business, if we've improved our capacity for free and independent action well enough, then we'll be profitable. If we haven't, we're going to be out of business.
Yeah, so one of the things that implies, Mark, is rethinking organization. So one of the big problems in management, which I think we're going to discard that word, but how do you organize to optimize that reorientation and adaptation, which you just talked about? We've come across a couple of business models out of China. One was called, I think, digitally guided autonomy, something like that, where the front end is all very small teams. Could be 3 people, a marketer, a product developer, and a customer service representative. And they're providing options to the market. The market buys or doesn't buy. That constant feedback is recycled, and they keep changing and making new offers and so on like that. And a firm is a consolidated number of 50 or 100 or 1,000 of those teams. Another one is Rendenhui, which is the higher organization in China, and they decentralized into thousands, literally thousands of micro enterprises, which are bigger than a team. It's maybe 50 to 70 people, but focused on one very specialized interaction with customers. And they call it zero distance to the customer. They want to be responsive to customers. So it seems like new forms of organization may be necessary to unleash the energy of the system that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, I always try to steer away from military analogies when I can, but they are worthy of study. And in this case, say the Marine Corps, again, my own tribe, there is a hierarchical structure. There's a commandant and there's the lowest privates and everything in between. So there is a very clear hierarchical structure. But generally speaking, in the operation of the forces, people are empowered down to the lowest level to carry out the mission. There was a concept years ago from a general who was a collaborator with Boyd and a friend of Boyd, General Charles Krulak, whose father, Lieutenant General Victor Krulak, there's a biography written by him, by the same author that wrote about John Boyd, wrote the biography of John Boyd. And there's this culture of pushing decisions down to the lowest level. And the concept was a strategic corporal, that the lowest level of leadership inside the Marine Corps, that young corporal leading his fire team or squad of Marines in a foreign country could possess and own the strategy of what had to happen for everybody themselves. And he would know what to do, or he or she would know what to do in accordance with that mission. That's the mutual trust that flows up and down the entire organization to push it down to the lowest level. And what that does, it gives the organization the things that Boyd talked about: variety, rapidity, harmony, and initiative. We can operate a lot faster when we can make decisions at the lowest level. And our youngest leaders that are facing the customer, so to speak, are empowered to make decisions on their own in accordance with the overall mission. And we're not so much worried of that. There's things that we're still supervised, and there's still monitoring and things like that. But that sort of trust, that sort of system, it's very rare in a lot of places, because it goes back to what you're talking about management, which is more hierarchical. It's more command and control. It's more formulaic. It's more boilerplate. It's more one size fits all for any situation versus something that's emergent. So back to this with that structure that the Marines have. So operationally somewhat flat, but structurally very hierarchical. That kind of flexibility and agility is why they can adapt in various environments. And you look at the history of the Marine Corps, they've literally been just about everywhere doing everything. That's never really like a standard mission. It varies all the time. And certainly the level of difficulty and the level of complexity and even chaos varies, but there's empowerment. Marines are empowered to do those things. They're empowered at the lowest level to get that done because they can understand what needs to be done. And I've always thought that if you strip out the military aspect of it and you really think conceptually, what is it saying? Well, conceptually, it's saying that we empower the people that we inspire and influence, aka lead. We empower them to make decisions at their level in accordance with the mission, and they're trusted to do that, and they can be ambassadors for our brand or for our product, our company, whatever it is that we're selling, versus the traditional model of I'm not able to make that decision, Mr. Hastings. I'm sorry. I need to talk to a supervisor. And then the supervisor says, I need to call my supervisor. And the next thing you know, time's elapsed, you're upset, and you're going to go find your business elsewhere. But that can be alleviated by, an adaptive entrepreneurial model or an adaptive strategic model where people are empowered to do that at the lowest possible level. And they understand clearly what needs to be done. That's how companies increase speed. That's how they create mismatches for their competition, by the way.
Yeah. So maybe the organization solution has been hiding in plain sight in the Marines. I agree with you. That's a perfect.
Yeah. And I just thought of a civilian example. When I actually learned this from a general that told me about this, but United Breaks Guitars. If you look on YouTube, there's a song called United Breaks Guitars. And long story short, basically there was this Canadian band that no one's ever heard of, at least here in Columbus, Ohio, or Pittsburgh, where I'm from. And they're looking out the window and they're watching the United employees throw their guitars around and break open the boxes. And these boxes break and the guitars come out and they break. And the cases in their land, wherever they were going, I think they were going to Omaha. They go down, they get to the baggage claim, and all their stuff is destroyed. And they go and they tell when you go to get your luggage, there's that front level, whatever, supervisor or place where you talk to the people, say, hey, I lost my bag or it's damaged. And it's the same thing. Oh, I got to talk to my boss. I got to talk to my supervisor. I got to talk. So there's all these layers of management that they eventually get to, and they say no. And the answer comes back no. And it's been weeks, months, who knows. So I forget the amount of time that it took, but basically the leader of the band got tired of waiting for United after months or whatever to resolve the issue and compensate them for the damage to their instruments. And they made this song called United Breaks Guitars, and it went viral. I don't know how many, millions and millions and millions of views. And it had an effect on United's reputation. It had an effect on their profitability to some extent. All of those managerial systems that were in place prevented them from doing the right thing at the lowest possible level to be empowered to take care of that customer that paid money with a reasonable expectation that their property would not be destroyed, and that if it was, they would be compensated for it. They make a viral video that becomes an asymmetry for United now. Now they're dealing with something that they never expected. That's not in the plan. That's a massive mismatch. While the rest of us are thinking, well, I'm never flying United because of what they do, And there was another, and not to bully on United, but when they pulled that one customer off and he ended up getting beaten by the police or something, but they how they overbook flights, and they went and they dragged this guy off, and he resisted, and they called security, and the same thing. All those algorithms, all those levels of management layers that prevent the people down at the lowest level to make an on-the-spot decision to say, sir, we need somebody to volunteer to leave, and we're going to give you, 5 free flights or something like that. They don't even have the power to do that. So they're not empowered. And what does that end up doing? Well, it slows things down, or it makes things adversarial. And again, it's another thing where they take a massive asymmetric hit on their brand for something that you could not have foreseen in a management exercise. You could not have foreseen in a strategy session to think that, hey, we're going to lose hundreds of millions of dollars. Why? Oh, we're going to break a bunch of guitars and the guy's going to write a song about it, or we're going to drag a customer off and, have him arrested or beaten while we free up the seat for somebody else. Like, no, you can't plan that. That's also the nature of complexity. Why those things don't work? Why those sorts of managerial systems don't really work? Because the environment's nonlinear and asymmetric.
Yeah, and you substitute then what Haya would call zero distance to the customer. We would call empathy, which is, hey, I can empathize with the customer, and that's how I'll manage this situation.
Well, again, going to Boyd, so empathy, humility, inspiration and influence. That's a direct human-to-human trait. So in everything we do at AGLX, it's all human-centric. So not spreadsheet-centric or not, number-centric. Humans are dealing with humans. That's the nature of That's the nature of business. We said at the beginning, people, ideas, things. That was Boyd's admonition, is that it always must be people, ideas, things in that order. That can't be violated. If it is, that creates internal adversity, which prevents an organization or a group or a team from being as effective as they could be.
Yeah, so let me drill down on that, Mark. And that I think of that in terms of quantification versus qualitative analysis or subjectivism. We've made management and economics to that extent into a mathematical system. It's all numbers, it's plans. You've got to make your number. You've got to hit all your ratios. You've got to hit your earnings targets and so on like that. Those are numbers. It's a quantitative mindset, and that takes the humanity out of management. You cost control as opposed to empathy, and targets instead of intent. So at AGLX, do you think about that? How do you deal with the quantification dominance of management?
I always like to ask people, because again, we talked about Blockbuster. How do you think Blockbuster looked at the numbers? How do you think they looked like, using the numbers? They were the number one in everything. They were the number one retail video experience. They were the number one in this category, number one. And their quantification of things was probably pretty good. And they had some great managers. And the mismatch, the novelty of something like Netflix, none of that mattered at all. It just flat out didn't matter, because a group of people had a completely different idea to employ things differently than the way home movie rental was traditionally done. Using Blockbuster as a prime example, but they weren't the only home rental store to go extinct. They all did, unless they adapted. And you can't do that if you're just quantifying. One of Boyd's, just back to John Boyd, one of his connections with the Marine Corps was that the Marines were in a position after the Vietnam War where they were doing a lot of organizational soul searching. And they're wondering, how did we lose this war? We had everything. We had all the weapons, all the technology, all the computers, all the capital, all the people, all the everything, all the intelligence, all the sensors, everything. And it didn't matter. We didn't have the right frame of thinking. We didn't have the ability to adapt to the nonlinear threat that just continuously kept eating away at it. And ultimately, that was the defeat. That was his connection. Boyd tapped into that when he interacted with the Marine Corps, because they were in that exact situation. When Boyd has a briefing or organic design for command and control, we talk about how in certain situations, people look at it like, we got to throw more money at it. We got to throw more technology at it. We got to throw more capital at it. We got to throw more sensors, more hardware. And it doesn't matter if the thinking's wrong. It doesn't matter if the entrepreneurial vision, or it doesn't matter if the leaders are, the leadership is thinking in a way that's not aligned with reality.
Yeah, so help me wrap this up, Mark. If the consulting world and the management science world is talking about reinventing management or rethinking management for the new age, my instinct is, let's get rid of the term. Let's not talk about management anymore, and let's talk about the kind of adaptive system that you're advocating. So
I don't use the word. Yeah, I don't use the word management. I use leadership, and I always emphasize leadership to quality, not leadership to title. And leadership to quality, as Boyd defined it. And Boyd said we need appreciation and leadership over command and control. But as he defined leadership, it was the art of influence and inspiration of other humans to collaborate, cooperate, to achieve big goals together with enthusiasm. And it seems that a company is going to run the same way. And the appreciation aspect of it is the recognition of something's worth, or the comprehension of how something actually works, or the understanding of how things really are and who people are, and that kind of a thing. That's completely different than command and control. That's human to human. That's human action. That's human decision making. That's human interaction. Because otherwise, I think that the opposite, it isolates humans.
Tell me a little bit more about your concept of leadership, because I have the sense that in the business literature and the celebration of the great leaders of industry, they're trying to say that they're superior people. They have better skills, or more knowledge, or they're just personally above the rest of us. It doesn't sound like you're saying that about leadership.
No, I mean, this is leadership, there's leadership, the person, right? The title. I mean, we could say John D. Rockefeller was the leader of Standard Oil. Think about where Standard Oil came from. It didn't come from a management exercise. It came from his ability to find new ways to price the refinement of kerosene into gasoline, right? I mean, there was a creative, novel idea that started that was the catalyst for all of that profit that Standard Oil came, or think of Steve Jobs and Apple, or Disney. At some point there was thinking behind this. There was the creation of novelty. And I think then the organizations that are really good at this, they understand that they have to keep doing that. They have to keep reinventing themselves. They have to keep finding new and novel ways to stay relevant in order to adapt, whether they're adapting to technology, whether they're adapting to cultural changes or cultural trends, whether they're adapting to, I don't know, just preferences. People have a taste for certain things. They're always adapting. They're always finding a different way. They're not stuck on any one idea. But that's a cultural characteristic, which I think, my belief, comes from quality leadership. Again, the quality of leadership, not so much the quality of the leader. We like to think of, I think these management and command and control discussions, we always like to think of like the one person. Use Berkshire Hathaway as an example. Berkshire Hathaway is a diversified corporation that the name Berkshire Hathaway actually comes from a textile mill in Western Massachusetts, what it originally was. And now it owns Geico and Dairy Queen and Brooks Running Shoes and Justin Boots and everything else. But it always comes down to like one man, as if Warren Buffett is the one guy that's up there pulling all the strings and making all this happen. And that's not how organizations run. I think that's where kind of maybe that might be a discussion for another episode of discussing leadership. I think we all operate on a bad definition. We don't have a good understanding of it.
Good. Well, let's do that. Let's have another discussion about that. But the note I've made is that leadership is the creation of novel ideas.
Yeah, it's the ability to influence and inspire others. One of the things that you would inspire an effective team to do is create mismatches, create novelty. Novelty is a mismatch. An iPod, when it first came out, that was a novel item that destroyed the rest of the MP3 players, if you remember those. The airplane was novel and then ultimately replaced the train and that kind of thing.
Yep. Cloud computing created or replaced mainframes.
Yeah. And that's again with appreciation and leadership versus command and control, that type of environment where we could recognize the worth of something and recognize the value, and people are allowed to contribute and share ideas, and they're learning. That's how they adapt, and that's how they can create, and they create mismatches for the competitors that they defeat.
Good. Well, thanks, Mark. We'll have that next conversation. You have a wonderful Substack where you share a lot of these ideas and your research. How do we send people there? How do they find you on Substack?
Yeah. Well, first I would send everybody to aglx.com. That's our company website. Our tag is to help people, individuals and teams, gain confidence and complexity. And you can tune into our podcast, which you've been a guest on, No Way Out. And when you go on the aglx.com webpage, you can see podcasts and you can click on that. My Substack is a passion project for me. It's called The Whirl of Reorientation. And it's basically dedicated to the big picture concepts of John Boyd and his theories. I don't get too granular, so I try to keep them light reading that you could digest when they come out. I try to get them out 2 or 3 times a week. You could understand them. The concepts are clear, and hopefully it incites more discussion. I would encourage people to definitely, if you've never heard of John Boyd, it's certainly worth your time to take a look at it. You can put my LinkedIn up. I'm happy to interact with anybody that wants to learn more about John Boyd. And it's critical because the theories that he talks about apply to us everywhere. They're only applicable where humans make decisions and actions, and that's everywhere. And there's an unfortunate reduction of John Boyd to just OODA loop. And that's even done poorly, as if it were a linear process that could be applied in certain situations. So John Boyd has not been done justice. We do our best on the podcast, Ponch and I. We've had a lot of guests that collaborated with Boyd. In fact, we even had Sean Callahan. He and I talked about how Boyd is often completely misinterpreted by academics, no less. And they've done a really poor disservice to learning. And what I always tell people is, sit down with us, sit down with me, and I can help you see these things. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. So if you're, say, a football coach, for example, because I've put out a lot of football articles lately just with playoffs and national championships and things. A lot of these fired coaches, my argument is they're probably not bad coaches. They probably know a lot about football. They probably know more about football than I'll ever know. And I grew up in Pittsburgh, a Steelers fan. We like to think that we know a lot about football. But what I bet they don't know much about is how the theories of John Boyd apply. And if I could show them how to look at it differently, just like I can show a business leader in any industry, or I've even worked with nonprofit executives, if I can show them a way to look at things differently, what they have right there, all that's going to emerge. Those mismatches will emerge, and they're going to know what to do very, very quickly. And they're going to see how they can gain a competitive edge by simply seeing what others don't and being able to make decisions and actions to exploit those mismatches faster than the competition and the rate of change. That's how they'll be successful. That's how they'll thrive.
Good. Well, Mark, let's leave it there. You're in the middle of playoff season. Thank you very much for today. Thanks for all your insights, and we'll definitely have that conversation about leadership next time. Thank you.
Can't wait. Thanks, Hunter.
This has been another episode of the Value Creators Podcast. Thanks for listening. You can visit thevaluecreators.com for links and resources related to this episode, and check out hunterhastings.com for more content on entrepreneurial business management based on value creation principles.